There's a question that has haunted psychologists, governments, and ordinary people for over a century. How far can a human being be pushed? What happens when you strip away the rules, the morals, the safety nets we all take for granted, and replace them with authority, pressure, or manipulation? Tonight, we're going to walk through some of the most disturbing social experiments ever conducted, real studies on real people, and the answers they uncovered were far more frightening than anyone could have predicted. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. In the winter of 1939, the state of Iowa was locked in the grip of another bitter cold season. Snow blanketed the flat farmland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. And in the small city of Davenport, perched along the western bank of the Mississippi River, the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home sat like a gray monument to abandonment. It was a sprawling institutional building, the kind of place where hallways echoed with footsteps, and children learned early that the world was not a kind place. The orphanage housed dozens of children, most of whom had already endured more loss in their short lives than many adults would experience in a lifetime. They had no parents to advocate for them, no family to ask questions on their behalf, and no voice to say no when a stranger from the University of Iowa came calling. That stranger was Mary Tudor, a 20-something graduate student working under the supervision of a man named Wendell Johnson, one of the most respected figures in the emerging field of speech pathology. Johnson himself was a stutterer, someone who had lived with the condition since childhood, and his entire career had become consumed by a single burning question. Where does stuttering come from? Is it something you're born with, wired into the brain before you ever speak your first word? Or is it something that can be created from the outside, something planted by the reactions and responses of the people around you? Johnson had a theory, one he called the diagnosogenic theory, which proposed that stuttering didn't begin in the mouth of the child, but in the ear of the parent. In other words, he believed that if you told a normal, fluent child that they were a stutterer, that relentless negative feedback could actually cause the child to develop the very condition you accuse them of having. It was a bold hypothesis, and Johnson wanted proof. But to get that proof, he needed subjects. And not just any subjects. He needed children who had no one looking over their shoulders. So Tudor drove from Iowa City to Davenport, walked through the doors of the orphanage, and selected 22 children. Some of them had been identified as stutterers by the institution's staff. Others spoke perfectly normally. Tudor divided them into groups. Half would receive what she called positive speech therapy, encouragement, praise, reassurance that their speech was fine. The other half would receive something very different. The children in this second group, including several who had no speech problems whatsoever, were told repeatedly and emphatically that they were stutterers. Tudor sat with each child for roughly 45 minutes during her visits, which occurred every few weeks over the course of about 5 months. She told the normally fluent children things like, "The staff here has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech." She told them their interruptions and hesitations were signs of stuttering, and that they needed to stop themselves immediately. She instructed orphanage staff to reinforce this message constantly, to correct the children every time they stumbled over a word, to make them hyper-aware of every tiny imperfection in their speech. And what happened next is exactly what makes this study so deeply unsettling. The children who had been perfectly fluent before the experiment started to change. They became withdrawn. They refused to speak in class. They whispered when they did talk. They shuffled their feet, gulped, and clamped their mouths shut rather than risk saying something wrong. One girl, who had been outgoing and confident, became so self-conscious about her speech that she stopped talking almost entirely. She began acting out, eventually running away from the orphanage and ending up at a reform school. Years later, she would say that the experiment ruined her life, that it was something she could never escape. The damage wasn't temporary. These weren't fleeting moments of anxiety that faded once tutors stopped coming. For some of these children, the effects lingered for decades, burrowing into their sense of self so deeply that they never fully recovered. Johnson never published the study. He knew, even by the standards of 1939, that what had been done was monstrous. His own colleagues were horrified when they learned the details, and the study quickly earned a nickname within the University of Iowa's Stuttering Research Program. They called it the Monster Study. The data sat locked away in archives for over 60 years, a buried secret that might have stayed buried forever if not for an investigative journalist named Jim Dyer, who in 2001 published a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News exposing the entire experiment. The revelation sent shockwaves through the academic community and beyond. The University of Iowa issued a formal public apology, and in 2007, a court awarded $925,000 to the surviving participants, although by that point, some of them had already died, carrying the scars of something they never even knew was an experiment. And when you sit with the details of the monster study long enough, what lingers isn't just the cruelty of it, but the particular brand of vulnerability that was exploited. These were orphans, children who already had no one fighting for them, and the researchers knew that. They chose that orphanage precisely because there would be no parents to ask uncomfortable questions or refuse consent. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the history of unethical experimentation, the deliberate targeting of those who cannot protect themselves. That same instinct, the willingness to experiment on the defenseless in the name of science, shows up in another study that had taken place 2 decades earlier, on the other side of the country, inside the walls of one of America's most prestigious universities. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, a psychologist named John Broadus Watson was about to conduct what would become one of the most famous and most controversial experiments in the history of the field. Watson was a man driven by a singular vision. He was the founder of a movement called behaviorism, which held that all human behavior, including emotions, could be explained through conditioning, through the simple pairing of stimuli and responses, the same way the Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov had trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. Watson didn't just believe this worked on animals. He was convinced it worked on people too, and he intended to prove it. His subject was a baby, approximately 9 months old, who came from the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children, a facility connected to the hospital where Watson worked. The child's mother was a wet nurse at the institution, and while the details of how consent was obtained remain murky at best, most historians believe the mother had little choice in the matter. The baby was given the pseudonym Little Albert, and Watson described him as remarkably stable and emotionally steady, the kind of child who rarely cried and showed almost no fear of anything. Watson began by presenting Albert with a series of objects and animals to gauge his baseline reactions. A white laboratory rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks with and without hair, cotton, wool, burning newspapers. Albert showed no fear of any of them. He reached for the rat. He touched the rabbit. He was, by all accounts, a curious and unflinching infant. Then Watson introduced the critical element. Each time Albert reached out to touch the white rat, Watson's assistant, Rosalie Rayner, struck a suspended steel bar with a hammer directly behind the baby's head. The crash was sudden and deafening. Albert startled violently. He whimpered. After several pairings of the rat with this terrifying noise, Albert's response changed. He began to cry at the mere sight of the white rat, even when no sound accompanied it. He would scramble away from it, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the animal he had once happily played with. But Watson wasn't finished. He wanted to see if this newly created fear would spread to other things, a phenomenon known as stimulus generalization. And it did. Albert showed distress when presented with a rabbit, a fur coat, a dog, even a Santa Claus mask with white cotton attached to it. The baby had been trained to fear anything that vaguely resembled the white rat, anything soft and furry and pale. Watson had succeeded in manufacturing a phobia in an infant, and he documented it all on film, recording the baby's transformation from fearless curiosity to trembling distress. What makes the little Albert experiment particularly haunting is what happened afterward, which is to say, nothing. Watson and Reimer made no attempt to reverse the conditioning. They never deconditioned Albert's fear. They simply stopped the experiment and moved on. Albert's mother apparently removed him from the institution shortly after the study concluded, and Watson reportedly knew she intended to do so, which means he likely understood that the window for undoing the damage was closing and chose not to act. For decades, researchers debated what became of little Albert. One investigation in 2009 suggested he may have been a boy named Douglas Merritt, who suffered from hydrocephalus and died at the age of 6. Another study challenged that conclusion, proposing that he was actually William Albert Barger, who lived a long life, but, according to family members, harbored an inexplicable aversion to animals, particularly dogs, until the day he died. Either way, the experiment's legacy is clear. A baby was deliberately traumatized for the sake of proving a theory, and no one ever came back to make it right. From the deliberate creation of fear in the most vulnerable, we move to something that might seem less dramatic on the surface, but is, in its own way, just as unsettling because it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how most of us move through the world. In 1951, a Polish-American social psychologist named Solomon Asch sat in a laboratory at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and designed an experiment so simple that its results should have been boring. He wanted to know how people respond when the group around them is clearly wrong, not ambiguously wrong, not arguably wrong, but obviously, unmistakably, you can see it with your own eyes wrong. Here's how it worked. Asch recruited male college students and told them they were participating in a vision test. Each student was placed in a room with 7 other people, all of whom appeared to be fellow participants. In reality, every single one of them was an actor, a Confederate working for Asch. The group was shown a card with a single line on it, and then a second card with 3 lines of varying lengths labeled A, B, and C. Their task was laughably straightforward. Identify which of the 3 lines matched the length of the original. The correct answer was always obvious. A child could have gotten it right. For the first few rounds, the Confederates gave the correct answer, and everything proceeded normally. But then, on certain predetermined trials, every single Confederate deliberately chose the wrong line. They pointed to a line that was clearly shorter or longer than the match and stated it confidently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The real participant, who always answered second to last or last, now found themselves in an impossible position. They could see the correct answer with their own eyes, but every person in the room had just chosen something different. The results were staggering. About 75% of participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer at least once during the experiment. On average, about a third of all responses on the critical trials were conforming, meaning the participant chose the answer they knew was wrong simply because everyone else had. Only about a quarter of participants never conformed, holding firm to their own perception every single time. And perhaps most tellingly, 5% of participants conformed on every single trial, abandoning their own senses completely in the face of group unanimity. When Asch interviewed the participants afterward, their explanations fell into a few distinct categories. Some said they genuinely began to doubt their own vision, wondering if maybe they were seeing things wrong. Others admitted they knew the group was wrong, but went along with it because they didn't want to stand out, didn't want to be the odd one, didn't want to face the discomfort of disagreement. A few even said they assumed the group must know something they didn't, that surely so many people couldn't all be wrong at the same time. What Asch had demonstrated, with nothing more than lines on a card, was the terrifying power of social conformity. The desire to fit in, to avoid conflict, to belong, was strong enough to override what people could see with their own eyes. And this wasn't under duress. No one threatened the participants. No one punished them for dissent. The mere presence of a unanimous group was enough to bend reality. But what happens when you take that instinct, that human tendency to define yourself by your group and to view outsiders as enemies, and you amplify it? What happens when you deliberately engineer conflict between groups of people who have no reason to hate each other? That was the question that consumed a Turkish-American social psychologist named Muzaffer Sharif in the summer of 1954, and to find out, he built a summer camp. Sharif, along with his wife Carolyn, recruited 22 boys, all around 11 or 12 years old, all from white, middle-class Protestant families in Oklahoma. They were psychologically healthy, well-adjusted, average students. None of them knew each other before the experiment began. The boys were divided into two groups and transported separately to a 200-acre Boy Scouts camp in Robbers Cave State Park in southeastern Oklahoma, deep in the Sombois Mountains, where the cabins were far enough apart that neither group could see or hear the other. The researchers posed as camp counselors and staff, and the boys had no idea they were part of a study. Their parents had been told it was a wholesome experience designed to build cooperation and leadership, a description that was, to put it charitably, incomplete. During the first phase, which lasted about a week, the two groups were kept completely separate. Each group bonded through typical camp activities, hiking and swimming and pitching tents, and quickly developed their own identities, their own leaders, their own inside jokes. One group named themselves the Rattlers. The other became the Eagles. They created flags, stenciled their names onto shirts, and developed fierce loyalty to their respective teams. Then came Phase 2, and that's when things got ugly. Sharif introduced the groups to each other and immediately pitted them against one another in a series of competitive activities: tug of war, baseball, cabin inspections, all with prizes and trophies going to the winners. The transformation was startlingly fast. Within days, the boys went from not knowing each other existed to actively despising the other group. Name-calling escalated from playful teasing to genuinely vicious insults. The Rattlers burned the Eagles' flag. The Eagles retaliated by trashing the Rattlers' cabin, turning over beds and scattering belongings. The boys refused to eat in the same cafeteria. They hurled food at each other. Physical fights broke out, and the researchers had to intervene multiple times to prevent serious injury. These were normal, well-adjusted children from good homes, and in less than a week of manufactured competition, they had turned into something that looked disturbingly like warring tribes. The final phase of the experiment sought to undo the damage through what Sharif called superordinate goals, problems that required both groups to cooperate. The camp's water supply mysteriously broke down, requiring everyone to work together to find and fix the problem. A truck carrying food for both groups got stuck, and only the combined effort of all the boys could get it moving again. A movie that both groups wanted to see required them to pool their money. Slowly, grudgingly, the hostility began to fade. By the end of camp, the boys were eating together, sitting on the same bus, and even choosing to spend time with members of the other group. It was a hopeful ending, but the ease with which the conflict had been manufactured in the first place was the real takeaway. Sharif had shown that prejudice and hatred didn't require deep-seated differences or historical grudges. All it took was arbitrary group membership and a little competition, and ordinary children could be turned against each other with alarming speed. The Robbers Cave experiment was published and discussed widely, but what many people don't know is that it wasn't Sharif's first attempt. A year earlier, in 1953, he had tried a similar experiment at a different camp, known as the Middle Grove Study. That attempt went even worse. The boys in the first study quickly figured out that they were being manipulated, and the conflict became so severe and uncontrollable that the researchers had to shut the whole thing down prematurely. One account describes Sharif becoming so frustrated with the failure that he was found drunk and cursing in the bushes. It was only after this chaotic first attempt that Sharif refined his methods and tried again at Robbers Cave. The fact that the published version presents a neat, three-phase arc belies the messier, more disturbing reality of how the research actually unfolded, and the ethical question of whether it was acceptable to deliberately engineer hatred in children who never consented to the experience. The question of what ordinary people are capable of, once you place them under the right kind of pressure, continued to haunt the field of psychology. And in 1961, one researcher decided to ask that question in its most direct and disturbing form. What would happen if you told a normal person to hurt someone, and what would they do if the person giving the order wore a lab coat? Stanley Milgram was a young assistant professor at Yale University, just 30 years old, with a background rooted in both psychology and personal history. He was Jewish, born in the Bronx to parents who had immigrated from Eastern Europe, and the shadow of the Holocaust had followed him his entire life. By 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Nazi genocide, was being broadcast around the world from a courtroom in Jerusalem. Eichmann's defense was chillingly simple. He said he was just following orders, and Milgram wanted to know, was that even possible? Could normal people, everyday citizens with no particular cruelty in their hearts, be made to inflict terrible pain on another human being simply because someone in authority told them to? He had originally planned to test his hypothesis in Germany, believing that Americans would prove resistant to such obedience, making them a perfect control group. But the results of his very first experiment at Yale were so alarming that he never made it to Germany. Here's how it worked. Milgram recruited men from the New Haven, Connecticut area through newspaper ads offering $4.50 for an hour of participation in what was described as a study on memory and learning. When each participant arrived at Yale's elegant Lindsley Chittenden Hall, he was introduced to another man who appeared to be a fellow volunteer, but who was actually an actor, a Confederate working for Milgram. Through a rigged drawing, the real participant was always assigned the role of teacher while the actor was always assigned the role of learner. The learner was then led into an adjacent room and strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his arms, in full view of the teacher. The teacher was seated in front of an impressive-looking machine covered in switches, dials, and labels. The switches were arranged in a row, each labeled with a voltage level that increased in 15-volt increments, starting at 15 volts and going all the way up to 450. Beneath the voltage numbers were written descriptions that escalated ominously, from slight shock at the low end, through moderate, strong, very strong, intense, extreme intensity, and finally, at the highest levels, simply the words danger, severe shock, followed by an ominous XXX. The experiment was presented as a study of how punishment affects learning. The teacher would read word pairs to the learner through an intercom, test the learner's memory, and administer a shock each time the learner gave a wrong answer, increasing the voltage with each mistake. Of course, no real shocks were being delivered. The machine was a prop. But the teacher didn't know that. Everything was designed to make the experience feel absolutely real. Before the experiment began, each teacher was given a sample shock of 45 volts, just enough to sting and convince them the machine worked. As the experiment progressed and the voltage climbed, the learner's pre-recorded responses grew increasingly desperate. At 75 volts, he grunted in pain. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released from the experiment. At 270 volts, he let out an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall separating the two rooms and refused to answer any more questions. Beyond 330 volts, there was only silence. Complete, terrifying silence. And still, the experimenter, a stern man in a gray lab coat standing beside the teacher, calmly instructed them to continue. He used a series of scripted prompts, each more insistent than the last. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before the experiment, Milgram had polled a group of psychiatrists and psychology students, asking them to predict how many participants would go all the way to 450 volts. The consensus was that fewer than 3% would, that only a fringe of deeply disturbed individuals would administer what they believed to be lethal shocks to a screaming stranger. The actual result was 65%. Nearly 2/3 of participants went all the way to the maximum voltage. Every single participant reached at least 300 volts. They sweated, they trembled, they bit their lips, they groaned, and some even broke into nervous, uncontrollable laughter. Many begged the experimenter to stop. But when he told them to continue, they obeyed. They pressed the switch. They delivered what they believed were potentially fatal shocks to a man who was screaming for mercy, and then went silent. Milgram ran 23 variations of the experiment over the following year, testing different conditions. When the learner was in the same room as the teacher, obedience dropped but didn't disappear. When the teacher had to physically press the learner's hand onto a shock plate, it dropped further, but still, 30% complied to the maximum level. When the authority figure left the room and gave instructions by phone, compliance plummeted. And when 2 other teachers, both Confederates, refused to continue, nearly all participants followed suit and stopped as well. What Milgram had uncovered wasn't that people are evil. It was something more nuanced and in some ways more frightening. People are astonishingly obedient to authority. and that obedience can overpower their own moral compass, especially when the authority figure is physically present and the victim is not. 6 years later, in the spring of 1967, the question of obedience and conformity took on an entirely different dimension, not in a university laboratory, but in a public high school classroom in Palo Alto, California. A 25-year-old first-year history teacher named Ron Jones was standing in front of his sophomore contemporary world history class at Cubberley High School, trying to teach them about the rise of Nazi Germany. He had covered the facts, the dates, the policies, the death camps, and as the lesson drew on, one of his students raised a hand and asked a question that Jones couldn't answer. How could the German people have let this happen? How could millions of ordinary people go along with something so evil and then claim they didn't know? Jones didn't have a good answer. He had read the textbooks and studied the history, but none of it adequately explained the how. So he made a decision that would define the rest of his career and haunt him for decades. He decided to show his students rather than tell them. The next day, Jones walked into class and wrote a phrase on the chalkboard: strength through discipline. He told his students they were going to try something new. He instructed them to sit up straight, feet flat on the floor, hands clasped behind their backs. When they wanted to speak, they had to stand beside their desks, and their responses had to be 3 words or fewer. Every statement had to begin with the words, "Mr. Jones." He drilled them on posture and response time, making them practice entering the classroom and sitting down in perfect order, over and over, until it was seamless. Jones expected the exercise to last a single class period. It was meant to be a brief demonstration, a taste of discipline to contextualize the history lesson. But when he walked into the classroom the next morning, he found something unsettling. Every student was already seated at attention, hands behind their backs, eyes forward. They greeted him in unison. "Good morning, Mr. Jones." They had loved it. Not reluctantly, not with the bored compliance of teenagers going through the motions, but genuinely. They were energized. They were focused. And they wanted more. So Jones leaned into it. On the second day, he added a new phrase to the board: strength through community. He told them they were now part of a movement, something bigger than themselves. He taught them a salute, a curved hand raised to the shoulder, and told them to use it whenever they saw a fellow member. He named the movement the Third Wave, a reference to the belief among surfers that the third wave in a set is the strongest. He handed out membership cards, some of which had a red X on the back, identifying those students as secret informants whose job was to report anyone who broke the rules. By the third day, the movement had grown beyond Jones's classroom. Students from other classes were asking to join. By the fourth day, the third wave had over 200 members, drawn from all 3 high schools in the Palo Alto district. Students who questioned the movement were shunned, reported, or banished to the school library. Friendships fractured along the line of who was in and who was out. Jones appointed personal bodyguards for himself, students who followed him between classes and stood watch during lessons. The atmosphere of the school had shifted from typical adolescent chaos to something regimented, zealous, and increasingly aggressive. Jones was losing control, and he knew it. He had created a monster in 5 days, and the students who were most invested in the third wave were the ones who scared him the most, because they weren't pretending. They had genuinely adopted the ideology. They believed in it. On the 5th day, Jones told the students that the third wave was part of a national movement, and that a presidential candidate associated with the movement was going to make a televised announcement that afternoon. He gathered over 200 students into the school auditorium, where cameras and reporters, actually friends of Jones posing as press, were set up. The students filed in, some wearing homemade armbands, all giving the salute. Jones led them in their chant: strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action. Then he turned on the television. The screen showed nothing but static. The students waited, confused. After several agonizing minutes, Jones stepped forward and told them the truth. There was no national movement. There was no presidential candidate. They had been part of an experiment, a demonstration of how fascism takes root, how easily ordinary people can be drawn into authoritarian movements through the promise of belonging, discipline, and purpose. He told them they were no better or worse than the German citizens who had stood by during the Holocaust. Then he played a short film about the Nazi regime, and the room went silent. Some students wept. Others sat in stunned, horrified recognition of what they had become over the course of 5 days. Jones later described the moment as one of the most emotional experiences of his life. The experiment had worked far better than he had ever imagined, and that was precisely the problem. It was not well documented at the time, and Jones didn't write about it publicly until nearly a decade later, when a chance encounter with a former student on a Berkeley street, during which the young man instinctively gave him the third wave salute, shook him enough to put the story on paper. The experiment eventually cost Jones his teaching position, though no one officially said it was the reason, and it went on to inspire books, a television movie, a German feature film, and multiple documentaries. But the central lesson it taught remains as relevant as ever. Fascism doesn't always arrive in jackboots and swastikas. Sometimes it arrives in a classroom, wearing the face of a popular teacher, and it promises you something you desperately want, a sense of belonging and a place in something larger than yourself. 4 years after Ron Jones's classroom experiment spiraled out of control in Palo Alto, another experiment was about to begin just a few miles away, this time in the basement of a building at Stanford University. It was the summer of 1971, and a psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo had just received approval to conduct a study that would become one of the most referenced, debated, and condemned experiments in the history of social science. Zimbardo's question was related to Milgram's, but approached it from a different angle. Instead of asking whether people would obey an authority figure, he wanted to know what would happen when you placed ordinary people into a system of power and stripped away their individual identities. Would the system itself shape their behavior? Would good people become cruel simply because a role demanded it? To find out, Zimbardo and his team converted the basement of Stanford's psychology building into a mock prison. The hallway became the prison yard. 3 small laboratory rooms were turned into cells, each barely large enough for 3 cots. A closet was converted into solitary confinement. The environment was designed to be realistic, oppressive, and disorienting. Zimbardo placed an advertisement in the Palo Alto Times and the Stanford Daily, offering $15 a day for male college students willing to participate in a study of prison life. 75 men applied. After extensive psychological screening and interviews, 24 were selected, all judged to be physically and mentally healthy, with no history of criminal behavior or psychological instability. They were predominantly white middle-class college students, the demographic that, on paper, should have been the least likely to descend into cruelty or despair. Through a literal coin flip, half were assigned to be guards, the other half became prisoners. The experiment began on a quiet Sunday morning, August 14th. The Palo Alto Police Department had agreed to participate, and real officers drove through town arresting the designated prisoners at their homes, handcuffing them in front of startled neighbors, reading them their rights, and transporting them to the station for fingerprinting and booking. From there, the prisoners were blindfolded and driven to the mock prison in Stanford's basement. Upon arrival, they were stripped, deloused with a spray, given smock-like uniforms with identification numbers instead of names, and fitted with a chain around one ankle. Their heads were covered with stocking caps to simulate shaved heads. From that moment on, they were referred to only by number. The guards were given khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses that prevented eye contact, wooden batons that they carried but were told never to use, and whistles. Zimbardo himself served as the prison superintendent, observing the proceedings and, as he later admitted, becoming far more invested in the role than a researcher ever should. The guards received minimal instruction. They were told to maintain order and that physical violence was prohibited, but beyond that, they were free to run the prison as they saw fit. The first day passed without major incident, but on the second day, everything changed. The prisoners staged a rebellion, barricading themselves inside their cells using their cots. The guards, enraged and caught off guard, retaliated with a ferocity that shocked even Zimbardo. They used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the doors, stripped them of their clothing, took away their beds, and threw the ringleaders into solitary confinement. From that point on, the guards began implementing increasingly inventive and degrading punishments. They forced prisoners to do push-ups, sometimes stepping on their backs while they struggled. They made prisoners clean toilet bowls with their bare hands. They subjected them to humiliating counts in the middle of the night, where prisoners were forced to stand and recite their numbers over and over for hours. They denied access to bathrooms, forcing prisoners to relieve themselves in buckets that were left to fester in the cells. What was most alarming was that this behavior wasn't coming from one or two bad actors. The guards self-organized into 3 shifts, and while the intensity varied, even the so-called good guards never intervened to stop the cruelty. They simply stood by, or at most, offered occasional small kindnesses that did nothing to challenge the system. The most sadistic guard, who earned the nickname John Wayne from the other participants, seemed to genuinely relish his power, crafting elaborate torments and working extended shifts even when he wasn't required to be there. The prisoners, meanwhile, were crumbling. By the 3rd day, one prisoner experienced such extreme emotional distress, uncontrollable crying, disorganized thinking, fits of rage, that he had to be released. Others followed. The remaining prisoners became passive and withdrawn, referring to themselves by number rather than name, mechanically obeying whatever the guards demanded. They had internalized their roles so completely that when one prisoner was offered the chance to leave if he forfeited his pay, he said he would have to discuss it with the other inmates first. He had forgotten that he was a free person who could walk out at any time. Zimbardo, by his own admission, had also lost perspective. He was so deep in his role as superintendent that he failed to see the suffering in front of him for what it was. It took an outsider, a graduate student named Christina Maslock, who was also his girlfriend at the time, to break through. She visited the prison on the 5th night and was horrified by what she saw: prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads while guards shouted at them. She confronted Zimbardo directly, telling him the situation was out of control and that what he was doing to those boys was terrible. Her intervention shook him, and on the 6th day, the experiment was terminated. It had been designed to last 2 weeks. The Stanford Prison Experiment became one of the most widely discussed studies in psychology, cited in textbooks, referenced in discussions about Abu Ghraib, invoked in debates about criminal justice reform. Zimbardo wrote a best-selling book about it called The Lucifer Effect, in which he argued that the experiment demonstrated the power of systems and situations to corrupt even good people. But in recent years, significant criticisms have emerged. Researchers have pointed out that Zimbardo actively encouraged the guard's behavior during a briefing before the experiment, that he was far from a neutral observer, and that some participants later admitted to performing for the cameras or exaggerating their distress. A French historian named Thibault Le Texier, after reviewing Zimbardo's personal archives, argued that the experiment was less a natural unfolding of situational power and more a directed performance shaped by the expectations of the researcher. Whatever the truth of these criticisms, the experiment's emotional impact is undeniable, and its central question, what happens to people inside systems of unchecked power, remains as urgent as ever. While Zimbardo was conducting his experiment in a university basement in California, the echoes of a far darker program were still reverberating through the corridors of American government. Because for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973, the Central Intelligence Agency had been running a real-life experiment in mind control that made anything happening in a psychology lab look quaint by comparison. It was called Project MKUltra, and it remains one of the most chilling examples of government-sanctioned human experimentation in modern history. The roots of MKUltra trace back to the early days of the Cold War, when the American intelligence community was gripped by a very specific fear. American prisoners returning from the Korean War were exhibiting strange behaviors, parroting communist propaganda, making false confessions, and in some cases appearing to have been genuinely brainwashed. The CIA became convinced that the Soviet Union and its allies had developed mind control techniques that could reprogram a human being, turning them into a compliant, controllable agent. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized MKUltra, a sprawling, top-secret program designed to find America's own mind control weapon. The man placed in charge was a brilliant, eccentric chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, who held a doctorate from Caltech and walked with a clubfoot, an unlikely figure to become one of the most prolific human experimenters in intelligence history. Under Gottlieb's direction, MKUltra grew into a sprawling operation with over 150 sub-projects funded through front organizations at more than 30 universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and Canada. The methods were as varied as they were brutal. Researchers tested the effects of LSD, mescaline, heroin, morphine, barbiturates, and amphetamines on human subjects. They experimented with electroshock therapy, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture. The goal was always the same: to find a way to break a human mind open and either extract its secrets or reprogram it entirely. The most infamous component of MKUltra involved LSD. Gottlieb was obsessed with the drug's potential, and in the early 1950s, he arranged for the CIA to purchase the entire world supply of LSD for $240,000. He then began distributing it to researchers across the country, asking them to study its effects and report back on its potential as a tool for interrogation and control. Some of these experiments involved willing volunteers, people who knowingly signed up to take the drug. But many, far too many, did not. The CIA administered LSD to mental patients in institutions who had no understanding of what was happening to them. They gave it to prisoners who were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation, creating a coercive dynamic that stripped any real meaning from the word consent. They slipped it into the drinks of their own colleagues and operatives, sometimes with devastating consequences. The most notorious case involved a man named Frank Olson, a 43-year-old Army biochemist and CIA employee who worked at the Fort Detrick Biological Weapons Facility in Maryland. In November of 1953, Olson attended a retreat at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake with a group of fellow scientists and CIA officers. During the evening, Gottlieb spiked a bottle of Cointreau with LSD and poured drinks for the unsuspecting group. After about 20 minutes, the men were told what had been done to them. Most recovered. Olson did not. According to witnesses, he became deeply disturbed, paranoid, and emotionally unstable in the days that followed. He reportedly expressed doubts about the morality of his work and asked to resign. 9 days later, in the early morning hours of November 28th, Olson fell from the 13th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York City and died on the sidewalk below. For over 2 decades, the official explanation was suicide. But when the Rockefeller Commission report on CIA activities was released in 1975, it revealed for the first time that Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge. His family received a personal apology from President Gerald Ford and a financial settlement of $750,000. But the questions didn't stop there. In 1994, Olson's son Eric had the body exhumed and a second autopsy performed. The forensic team found a previously unreported wound on Olson's skull, consistent with a blow to the head that had not been mentioned in the original medical examiner's report. The New York District Attorney subsequently changed the classification of Olson's death from suicide to unknown. Eric Olson spent the rest of his life publicly arguing that his father had been murdered by the CIA to prevent him from exposing the true nature of MKUltra. And the scale of the program was staggering. Beyond LSD, MKUltra encompassed experiments in which subjects were kept in drug-induced comas for weeks, given massive doses of electroshock therapy designed to wipe their memories clean, and subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation in isolation chambers. One sub-project at a Kentucky addiction research center kept 7 men on LSD for 77 consecutive days. Another involved administering the drug to a single mental patient for 174 days straight. The CIA even set up a network of safe houses in San Francisco and New York under a sub-program called Operation Midnight Climax, where agents hired prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men to apartments fitted with one-way mirrors. The men were secretly dosed with LSD, while CIA operatives watched from behind the glass, sipping cocktails and taking notes on the drug's effects. One agent later described the operation in a letter to Gottlieb as fun, fun, fun. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal was engulfing the Nixon administration, and congressional investigators were beginning to look more closely at intelligence community abuses, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of virtually all MKUltra records. Thousands of documents were shredded, making it impossible to ever know the full extent of the program. When congressional hearings took place in 1977, former CIA employees testified but claimed to remember almost nothing. Gottlieb himself was questioned and offered minimal information, later telling colleagues that the entire MKUltra effort had been useless, that mind control was impossible, and that everything they had done had been for nothing. He retired quietly in 1972 and lived out his remaining years in rural Virginia, raising goats and volunteering at a hospice. He never faced criminal charges. neither did anyone else. The final story tonight concerns a single individual, and in some ways, it's the most disturbing of all, because it demonstrates what can happen when the full weight of scientific authority is brought to bear on one small life. In 1965, in the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, a woman named David Reimer gave birth to identical twin boys. They were named Bruce and Brian, and by all accounts, they were healthy, normal infants, indistinguishable from one another in every way that mattered. But at 6 months of age, both boys developed a urinary condition called phimosis, and their doctor recommended circumcision. The procedure on Brian went smoothly. The procedure on Bruce did not. The surgeon used an unconventional cauterization method, and the equipment malfunctioned. Bruce's penis was severely and irreparably burned. The family was devastated, left with an infant son whose most basic anatomy had been destroyed by a medical error. Searching for answers, Janet and her husband Ron eventually saw a television appearance by a man named Dr. John Money, a prominent psychologist and sexologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, who was making bold public claims about the nature of gender. Money believed that gender identity was not determined by biology, but by upbringing, that a child could be successfully raised as either sex as long as the assignment was made early enough and reinforced consistently. He called this the theory of psychosexual neutrality, and he was actively looking for a case that would prove it. When the Reimers contacted Money, he saw the perfect opportunity. Bruce was a biologically normal male whose physical anatomy had been destroyed by accident, and crucially, he had an identical twin brother who could serve as the control subject, a genetic clone raised as a boy against which the success of the reassignment could be measured. Money encouraged the Reimers to have Bruce surgically reassigned as female. At 22 months old, Bruce underwent an orchiectomy, the removal of his testes, along with the construction of rudimentary female genitalia. His name was changed to Brenda, and his parents were instructed to raise him as a girl and never, under any circumstances, to tell him the truth about his birth. For the next decade, the Reimer family made annual trips to Johns Hopkins, where Money conducted behavioral sessions with both twins. What happened during those sessions would later emerge as one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. According to both David and Brian Reimer, who spoke about their experiences as adults, Money forced the twins to engage in what he called sexual rehearsal play, activities that he believed were necessary for healthy gender development. He instructed the children to inspect each other's genitals. He made them act out sexual positions, with David playing the female role, getting on all fours while Brian was told to position himself behind him. On at least one occasion, Money took photographs of these activities. When the children resisted, Money reportedly became angry and intimidating. Both twins later described these sessions as deeply traumatic, experiences they struggled to discuss even decades later. Meanwhile, Money was publishing papers and giving interviews in which he described the case as a resounding success. He reported that Brenda was a happy, well-adjusted girl whose behavior was clearly feminine, starkly different from her boyish twin brother. His account of the John Joan case, as he called it, was cited in textbooks, referenced by medical professionals around the world, and held up as definitive proof that gender could be socially constructed. It influenced the treatment of thousands of children born with ambiguous genitalia or injured during medical procedures, many of whom were surgically reassigned based on Money's recommendations. But the reality inside the Reimer household was nothing like what Money was publishing. Brenda was miserable. From the earliest ages, the child rejected dolls, dresses, and anything associated with traditional femininity. Brenda wanted to play with trucks and roughhouse with the boys. She was bullied relentlessly at school, where her classmates could sense that something was different. She was aggressive, restless, and deeply unhappy in ways that her parents couldn't explain. Her teachers struggled. Her friendships suffered. By adolescence, even as the estrogen therapy money prescribed had begun to develop breasts, Brenda felt wrong in her own body in ways she couldn't articulate. At 13, Brenda told her parents that if they made her see Dr. Money one more time, she would take her own life. It was then, faced with their child's anguish, that Ron Reimer finally told Brenda the truth. Everything. The botched circumcision, the surgery, the reassignment, the years of deception. Brenda's response was immediate and absolute. She stopped taking estrogen. She chose a new name, David. She began testosterone therapy, had surgery to remove the breasts that had developed, and undertook a series of procedures to reconstruct male anatomy. At 22, David married a woman named Jane and adopted her 3 children. For a time, it seemed like he might finally find peace, but the damage had been done, layer upon layer of it, over a lifetime. David struggled with depression, unemployment, and the overwhelming weight of what had been taken from him. His twin brother Brian, who had also been deeply affected by the sessions with money and struggled with his own mental health, died in 2002 from an intentional overdose of medication. David visited his grave every day. Then, in 2004, David's wife told him she wanted a separation. 2 days later, on the morning of May 4th, David Reimer drove to a grocery store parking lot in Winnipeg and took his own life with a shotgun. He was 38 years old. John Money never publicly commented on David's death. Colleagues said he was mortified by the outcome, but he never apologized and never accepted responsibility. He died of natural causes in 2006. The case of David Reimer stands as one of the most devastating examples of what can happen when a researcher's theory becomes more important than the person it's being tested on, when the need to be right overshadows the humanity of the subject, and when the entire apparatus of science and medicine conspires to maintain a lie rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. Every experiment we've talked about tonight shares a common thread. Whether it was orphans being told they were broken, a baby being taught to fear, college students bowing to group pressure, boys being turned into enemies, ordinary men shocking strangers on command, teenagers marching toward fascism, prisoners and guards losing themselves in roles they never chose, an intelligence agency poisoning its own people, or a child being forced to live a lie. The question at the center is always the same. What are humans capable of when the right pressures are applied? The answer, as it turns out, is almost anything. And the most disturbing part isn't that these experiments happened. It's that the behaviors they revealed aren't confined to laboratories and classrooms. They're happening all around us every day, in boardrooms and courtrooms and living rooms, wherever power meets vulnerability and authority goes unchecked. So the next time you find yourself going along with something that doesn't feel right, ask yourself, whose experiment are you in? If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps more than you know, and I'll see you in the next one.